If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, I got a flashback for you. Remember Saturday mornings? Come on, you know you do. Remember waking up, hitting the floor in your little Superman onesie and running to the TV room? Not walking, running. The blankie, the sofa, adjust the rabbit ears, and it was like Christmas in miniature every single week. Cartoons on every channel all morning. Cute animals, space adventures, racing cartoons, superheroes, Godzilla, post-apocalyptic fiction. And they got away with it. Sex, violence, my goodness, the blessed violence. Smoking, no trigger warnings in the upper left corner of the screen, just smoking. And guns, lots and lots of guns. It was amazing. Then came Sunday morning, and the only cartoon was this: Davy and Goliath. None of the good stuff. If you were like me, sitting there in your clip-on bow tie, waiting on the family to get ready for church, this claymation pile of garbage was the only game in town. I get that it felt the need to teach simple morals, but why did it have to be so mind-numbingly dull? Like nearly all Christian fiction. Seriously, rack your brain trying to think of every book, movie, comic, anime, whatever that has ever been called visionary, groundbreaking, avant-garde. Does any work of Christian fiction come to mind? I'll get even more specific. Hollywood, and really all of performing arts, at least, have long had a strong Jewish influence. Listen to Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song if you don't believe me, but culturally Jewish. How many of those artists are Orthodox Jews? None that I know of. The fact is that you don't find that kind of creativity in Orthodox communities of any religion. When they get quote-unquote creative, you tend to get Davy and Goliath. Not Looney Tunes or Thundar. You get simple, repetitive stories and images. You get art that rarely takes any risks. Except for that one time. And that's the story we're going to look at here in a minute. The one example I can think of how you truly escape the orthodoxy trap. So, not a negative example like the shack in the last video, or the Left Behind series in the next one. But here we'll see a positive example of how to do it right. But what is the orthodoxy trap, and how did C.S. Lewis avoid it? In the last video, I talked about the 7 churches at the beginning of Revelation, and how I think it's a clear analogy for the way that Christianity affects cultures over time, starting with a series of compromises meant to make the faith more inclusive, and winding up with a lukewarm religion, a faith that's comforting but not life-changing. And we saw that early on in those compromises, you reach the tolerating that woman Jezebel level, where a more goal-oriented, aspirational belief system starts down the road to matriarchy. It becomes more motherly. And along with that, a sort of I'm going to change the world for the better focus on achievement changes into a much more I just don't want any of that icky stuff to hurt me focus on avoiding the unpleasantries of life. Now, since that is what has happened to most every culture the Hebrew Bible has been translated into over the centuries, you probably think the Bible is a lot more like a really long and boring Davy and Goliath cartoon, not realizing that actually it's much more like the Saturday morning variety, complete with profanity. Yes, there are cuss words in the original Bible texts, sex, including some fairly risque descriptions of positions, and gobs of violence. Nearly all of that has been softened since then by that motherly, I don't want your precious little mind to think any bad thoughts mentality. And I say this all in the feminine as an analogy. Of course, these were translated by men, and so what we really have was guys like old St. Jerome softening the juicy bits down to lay with each other, or even knew each other, because he had some serious hang-ups. And this is the guy who wrote the first Latin Bible that almost every translation descended from for the next 1,500 years. Now, at this point, any of my fellow religious folks could ask, but isn't it a good thing to avoid sin? And my answer is, sure. But if you make that the central purpose of your life, well, that value system comes with some weird side effects. Take, for instance, this verse that I posted in the last video, but I did it in a softened English translation. Here it is, direct from Hebrew. Yeah, all those contemporary Christian songs saying, of God. You say I am strong, you say I am beautiful, and all the rest, yeah, they're leaving a couple adjectives out. This theme of a lack of shrewdness, stupidity, it reappears. But why? Why would Orthodox believers be uniquely susceptible to this? After all, striving for wisdom is a part of the Judeo-Christian teaching. And in the last millennium, it was Christian religious scholars that drugged the European world out of the Dark Ages into the Renaissance. So, what are we really talking about? We're talking about a type of tunnel vision that comes with being inherently defensive in the way you approach the world and in the way you approach new information. Let me show you how this works. Back in my clip-on bow tie days, I was taught that the Earth formed around 6,000 years ago, in 4000 BC. What I didn't realize is that number, 4000 BC, was just like Jeremiah 4:22. It had been softened. No. The real number comes from Catholic Bishop James Ussher in 1650, and it's sunset, October 23rd, 4004 BC. Now, if you have a shred of rationality, your first thought should be, wow, that's awfully specific. And just how did our Catholic Archbishop decide that the universe blinked into existence right at that moment? Mostly by adding up a set of numbers found here, where we see a group of people who lived really, really long lives. Forgive me, for the sake of video length, I have to hit this quickly. What happened next was Ussher's calendar got included as a reference in the back of the King James Bible. Christians at the time tended not to distinguish in terms of authority between the Bible books themselves and those references there in the back. And they wound up spending the next 4 centuries piling on goofy explanations for how this theory, what we call young earth creationism, could be true. You know the ones. The bones of dinosaurs were just put there by God to make the world look old. People lived 1,000 years because Adam's DNA was nearly perfect. And besides, there was a layer of water around the earth that kept them young. And we find that pattern, something getting uncritically accepted when it probably shouldn't have been, then a crust of silly explanation forming around that idea that could have been understood simply if we'd only kept an open mind, like the ages in those long-lived people in Genesis. They make perfect sense if they were on a different calendar system. Like later with Abraham and Sarah, living into their hundreds. Sarah so beautiful she was fighting off kings and pharaohs in her 60s. Except they came from a region at a time where years didn't always measure solar progression, but often just counted harvests, which in that area often happened more than once a year, meaning if we converted their years into ours, there may not have been anything unnatural about their lifespans. And Sarah may well have still been in her prime when Abraham kept calling her his sister. As for Methuselah and the boys, we may be looking at a record from a time back in the remote history where it wasn't even solar progressions or harvests, but starting from some rite of passage event, it was lunar cycles, about 30 days apiece, which is what primitive tribal societies sometimes did. This would still leave some issues to work through, like how is there a specific month in the flood narrative, and were the ages for people on the same system as the overall dating? So something like the time period that the Hebrews stated as having lived in Egypt, was that in harvest, or was that in Egyptian years, which were solar? Tricky, but those are a whole lot simpler than how does water in the atmosphere prevent aging, and if more sun does age you, how is this guy still above ground? I'll do another one here in a minute. I could do 1,000. But let me make it clear that if you're devoutly religious, tunnel vision is not a foregone conclusion. Nevertheless, with C.S. Lewis, we see the tension. Clive Staples Lewis started out in an Orthodox Anglican setting. As a teenager, he turned his back on religion, calling himself an atheist. And although there were other things going on at the time, it certainly seems like he either viewed this as freeing him to study mythology and the occult, or even perhaps that his interest there was part of his decision to leave the church. Either way, it's clear he felt these two things could not be entirely reconciled. He changed that view later, but only after years of studying all sorts of myths and legends that would give him the raw material to produce series like Narnia and Perelandria. And so we see someone who, if he had lived his life in the typical view of so many Orthodox Christians, that something like the occult cannot be studied lest you fall into temptation, he probably would have only produced safe, derivative works of art. Lewis, our prime example, only broke this mold by turning away from the faith, which is too bad because it was completely unnecessary. One more example to make this point for how to look at this stuff. In my last video, I highlighted how the modern critique for every Christian author seems to be, they don't agree with me, therefore they're a heretic. And if C.S. Lewis was alive today, I'm sure he would get the same treatment, since not all of his beliefs squared with mainline Protestant Christian theology. For instance, he thought stories like Jonah and the whale were fictional rather than actual historical events. The typical reaction to this is to say, false teacher, which completely misses the point. C.S. Lewis didn't hold that belief as an article of faith. He just thought it was more likely to be folklore rather than history based on the information he had at the time. He knew he might be wrong. And for a religious scholar who isn't afraid to look at any and all available information, examining it like that, working in probabilities as you obtain more information, what we call logic, you can now make the case that Jonah and the whale was meant to be taken as historical, based on its difference with folklore and its similarities to other historical narratives from that time period. Historical narratives that simply include miraculous or at least unexplained events. And if you aren't afraid of what previously unknown knowledge might do to you, you'll probably learn about how the various aspects of knowledge of the world and of human nature connect to each other. This video, which taught my suggestions while looking at the last video, is a study of John chapter 10, where Jesus quotes a psalm wherein God is saying, I have called you gods. But who was he talking to, and what did he mean? Our plucky young apologist likes lists, so we get another list. He then spends the rest of the video asserting number 1 and arguing against the other 3. The problem is the list. You see, the real answer is in fact number 1, but only because number 1 is closely related to number 4. If this list was all you had to work with, number 4 would actually be the best answer. You see, as an expert on mythology like C.S. Lewis could have told you, every culture has their aspirational figures, their superheroes. China gives us martial arts masters jumping into the sky. The American Old West gave us gunslingers shooting from the hip. And pagan cultures gave us gods and demigods, not an omniscient, all-powerful creator. These were basically humanoid creatures with superhuman powers, so much like our modern comic book characters that we just took a few of them and put them straight into our comics, and voila, a perfect fit. The Hebrews had these too. They were called judges, and they got a whole book of the Bible dedicated to their acts of daring do, complete with the repetitive statement, in that day Israel had no king, everyone did as they saw fit. In other words, it was a lawless land, like the Wild Wild West, and needed these kinds of superhuman gunslingers. And a lot of these were heroes in the Batman or Nick Fury mold, but there was one who was superhumanly strong and had a kryptonite-like weakness. We don't use him in comics. We do use his name. So the issue is that our YouTuber is working off of incomplete information, and so is just assuming that the judges in this case are the kind of judges who sit behind a bench with a gavel, not realizing that's not what the psalm is referring to, and that's not how the passage is using it in John chapter 10. And so Jesus' use of this passage suddenly makes sense. He's being questioned in regards to his claims of authority and visible displays of miraculous power. He answers with that passage and includes the modifier to whom the word of God was given, highlighting the fundamental difference between demigods and judges, which is you weren't born that way, a la paganism. You got that way thanks to your relationship with your Creator. And he's saying, since thanks to that Creator, you're capable of more than you know, then it makes sense that you don't know what he's capable of. And of course, you don't have a clue what the infinite creator of the universe is capable of. But you're not going to get that kind of insight from the typical Christian scholarly voices, because those voices tend to be infected with tunnel vision. So often, they ignore broader historical context. Too defensive, too afraid of straying off into sin. Here, they're ignoring comic books, like this one, Daredevil 181, my all-time favorite. Amazing what you can learn if you're not terrified of the unknown. And as C.S. Lewis showed us, amazing what you can create if you just pull off those blinders. This is David Reich at From the Bunker. Click like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and keep the videos coming. Also, see the link below to order Book 1 of the Holocaust Engine series, our pandemic post-apocalyptic horror that won the Pinnacle Award for the best science fiction novel of 2020.